I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Eliminate Hidden Costs in Offshore Outsourcing. My name is David Goodstein, and I am a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. It is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Offshoring Success. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. But before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you a few tools that you'll be able to use throughout today's session. We encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the question box, type your question into the space provided, and click the Submit button. Today's webinar will be recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include the link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Frank Casale, founder and CEO of the Outsourcing Institute, for the formal introduction of today's speaker. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David, and welcome everyone to today's session. It's no surprise to most of you that you can save some money by offshoring, and it's not much of a surprise to many of you on this line that there are some, hidden costs there. And at the end of the day, one of the more common complaints or concerns that we hear from members is that they ended up not saving all the money they thought they would. So our focus here today is to really hone in on what are those hidden costs, how to identify them, and how to really mitigate some of the uncertainty here and optimize your offshore outsourcing portfolio, if you will. We're fortunate to have presenting today and Sathanarian. He goes by Sath. He's a longtime member of the Outsourcing Institute, heads up an organization called Offshoring Success, appropriately titled. And Sath has a significant amount of experience with regard to outsourcing, not only from a corporate perspective, but also as an entrepreneur and an advisor. He brings a ton of experience, and if you've ever spoken or met with Sath, he also brings a ton of positive energy as well to any conversation or any project he works on. So look forward to learning today and having some fun. I think there's a quick commercial slide here. So I'll just speed through this. My sense is half of you know who we are, maybe the other half do not. We are one of the larger, maybe the largest outsourcing member network on the planet. We have over 70,000 members. Buyers typically come to us for trends, best practices, case studies. Providers tend to come to us to get market intelligence and really for exposure and sponsorship opportunity. As far as services, we do provide training for both buy side and sell side. We have some pretty nifty software that we've developed that allows buyers to develop their own outsourcing RFP much faster, better, at a fraction of a cost than they would if they had to go outside and pay retail, if you will, to have an advisor do that. And we have a handful of interesting other services, including promotional opportunities. There's a recruiting service here as well for those looking for jobs or looking to hire. And if you keep your eyes and ears open in the coming weeks, we'll be making some interesting announcements as well as far as new service offerings and new programs. In a nutshell, we do track both onshore, offshore, and nearshore outsourcing. Today's focus obviously will be offshore. So that's it for my commercial. And Sath, thank you again for taking the time to put this presentation together and to share it with our membership. Let me pass it along to you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you all for attending this webinar where I can share my thoughts and experiences with you. I am going to begin my presentation by sharing with you results from a few industry surveys. Roughly 50 to 60% of offshoring attempts fail to meet expectations. This may not come as a surprise to many of you there, but that's an industry statistic, and that bears with our own experience working with various clients. Now, to improve effectiveness of your offshore outsourcing, you need to address three areas: finance, operations, and strategy. For example, in the area of strategy, you would want to take a look at things like which models are you going to use? Is it staff augmentation, outcome-based, rural outsourcing, insourcing, and so on? Operational issues, you would want to address things like outsourcing management processes, schedules, quality, and metrics. Now, coming to the finance area, examples: what benefits are you really getting? How much are you investing into this? And budgets versus actuals. What I find is it is in that area a lot of people have trouble with. There are hidden costs or things that they did not expect when they went into offshoring that impact their budgets, and that is what causes them to not realize the benefits that they were expecting. So that brings me to today's topic: how to eliminate hidden costs and get your program back in control. And I will speak to this, the causes of that, in the next slide. Okay, in working with a number of companies during the past 20 years or so, I find half a dozen issues continue to crop up. Okay, I have listed these on this slide here, and I will expand on the problems and my recommendations on what you can do about it during the next several slides. Let's go to the next slide. Number one on my list is poor vendor selection, and I will detail the problem in the next slide. Okay, many users of outsourcing, they find that, okay, the vendor is not delivering as originally expected. We already said that, but this happens sometimes at the very beginning of a relationship, but more often than not, this begins to happen when what I call the honeymoon period is over. In the initial, let's say 3 to 6 months or so, everybody from both sides are paying a lot of attention to it, a lot of TLC. Things go okay. But as time goes on, things begin to fall apart. So this means that you, as the user of these services, would have to recover from projects, recover from situations. It's money you did not plan on spending, and it's a hidden cost to you. Now, let's go to the next slide so I can provide you my recommendations. What can you do? Let's first take a look at why does this happen with a vendor. This begins with the choice of vendor. These are fundamentals. This is a building block. This is a fundamental thing before we even look at all the other stuff. You chose a vendor. Too often what happens is companies go take a look at a few vendors, whether they're recommended by the board, their colleagues, or someone else in the industry, and they decide upon a particular vendor, but the criteria for selecting the vendor predominantly ends up being price. What I would like to submit to you is doing this on price alone does not work. You should be looking at a few other factors, and I'm going to list four factors that I found to be very useful. Number one is size. Let's say you're a company that is planning to outsource 25 people's worth of offshoring. And you are now talking to one of the top 5 vendors in India. You are going to lose the long haul, or maybe even the shorter pretty quickly. Just imagine somebody in India with a top-tier company, their strength is 100,000 plus people, and you have 25 people's worth of work. What do them, regardless of what the way you say to them. They all want to be nice. But you will not get over time the best people or the best service. So you need to pick a vendor for whom your business and your business size actually matters. The next on this slide is culture. So here's what I mean by that. Every company, or even within companies, every part of the company has got some unique culture. For example, if you are outsourcing product development versus IT services versus BPO, the processes, the people, the sensitivities, all those things vary. This is what I mean by the culture. Carefully look at it and find a company that closely matches your needs. Expectations of growth. This I found can be an issue from both sides, both for you and the vendor. Let me share a real live example that I saw here recently. Here is a company that promised the vendor that we will outsource 25 people initially, but we'll grow the operation to 100 people over the next 1 year. Things went on okay with the 25 people. The 1 year went by, 18 months went by, 2 years went by. They were still between 25 and 30 people. So the vendor obviously was disappointed that the growth did not happen. And once they got to that point, for whatever reason, maybe there may be a combination of reasons, the service level begin to go down. So the client was unhappy. It was kind of a spiraling down effect, if you will. This opposite can also happen. Say you are looking at growing the operation from 25 to 100 people, that the vendor is not able to produce those 100 people, 100 right people that you want. So make sure not only what you start with, but over time what you want to grow to. Are you able to do it as the client? Is the vendor able to provide those growth for you? Both are very key considerations in choosing the right vendor. Staff, this is the reason you actually go offshore. Make sure that you look at resumes, you review, do phone interviews, maybe even you go there in person. All of this may be pretty important when you're establishing a relationship, until such time each of you know what the other person is capable of doing and what you mean by those things are. So I think that this is a very key consideration. So at the end of the day, if you pick the right vendor, you reduce your chances of unexpected expenses that you got to recover from. Let's go to the next slide. A defective contract. Okay, the problem with contract, which is on the next slide, is most contracts define rates and legal issues. Metrics, performance issues, operational issues are rarely in there per se. So what can you do about that? On the next slide, I talk about 3 different approaches that you can take. You involve in the negotiation upfront the operations staff. They and the vendor and whoever else need to take a look at, can you put in explicit metrics in your particular case in the contract? For example, I'll give you some examples here. You may want, the growth rate may be one of the things. Or vendors do planned rotations. It is under their control, but you don't want to get surprised by that. Do you also want to provide penalties for poor performance or non-performance, and at the same time provide incentives for exceeding objectives and goals? So these are some of the key considerations that you should actually take into, put it in place before you finalize a contract. Okay, with that, moving on, broken promises. This happens, the thing that I'm talking about here is the vendor appears to commit to performance targets, but they're not coming through. Here are the couple of conversations that I had recently here with some clients of mine, and I will quote that for you, and this drives the point home. So manager, one of the managers who is an operating manager, he says, Seth, why doesn't the offshore team just say what they really mean? They cannot do it other than say yes and still not do it. Another manager told me, Seth, I'm really in trouble. I said, why? He says, I had a meeting of all the people, offshore and onshore, on one joint telecon. We went over all the details, and the onshore team asked a few questions. I clarified that. And the offshore team did not speak up, did not say anything. And I assumed that everybody was on board and we will meet the deadlines. It is a couple of days from the deadline now. Now I get an email message from the lead offshore that there is no way they will be able to meet the deadline. Now, not only am I very upset about this, what am I going to tell my boss? He is going to be very upset with me. So, what are his choices? He has to find some way to go recover from this situation. Again, an unplanned cost, both in time, management time, and maybe they may have to hire some people locally. Those are all things that are additional times, additional expense rather. Now, what can you, these are my recommendations. There are 3 areas I want you to pay attention to get out of this situation. First is, you know, one of the reasons that people are surprised, and I hear these kinds of quotations, is could be actually on your home base. Here is a situation that quite happens quite a lot. A lot of managers are thrown into managing teams offshore with very little or absolutely no preparation. One day they inherit 20 or 25 people staff, and all their career they have been managing somebody locally right there in front of them. Now they have to manage people at a distance, and they have to operate in a different culture. So the people, you know, yes sometimes does not necessarily mean an yes, depending on the culture that you're working with. So these are nuances that you need to make your managers come to grips with. So this has to do with how do you understand and operate in multicultural environments, how are you going to be effective. Then the next set of issues is how do you operate 10,000 miles away? If it is distributed development, how do you integrate? You got to have very clear-cut processes on who does what and when. How often you are going to escalate, who do you escalate to, under what condition you do escalation, how often you review progress, and when they provide progress, what does it really mean, how you're going to ask all those specific questions so you have clear visibility and control so you don't get surprised like the second manager that I made a quotation of, okay? So those are all remote management processes. Okay, the next item is low productivity. I'm talking about low productivity by the offshore team. So here is this quote that I hear, variations of this. If this is really true, the next question is where are the savings and why is my company doing this offshore development to start with? So here are my recommendations. You begin the whole process by making sure you have the right offshore staff. I am repeating this, although I talked about it earlier, because this is a very important point. Your staff has to be really right set of people. At the end of the day, that's what you're going there for. If they are not right, you won't get the right results. Your productivity will not be there. Right projects. I quite often, even today, so offshoring has been around for 20 plus years. Some of the companies would say, look, I don't want to do this task here, and I'm simply going to offshore it. There is no real thought given to what specific projects that will in fact lend themselves to working well in the offshore environment. There is an example I want to share with you. For example, the user interface projects, they are tough to articulate to somebody who has no idea about the American culture. Things that we take so much for granted here because we live here, we understand things implicitly, you can't write everything down. That may be a poor choice to go forward with as the first set of projects. Now, this all leads to my recommendation that you ought to have pretty clear set of guidelines of what projects you want to offshore. And this can be a living document. As experience changes, you may want to update that. The second point I want to make here is write project structure. The typical model is staff augmentation. And I will illustrate this point by sharing with you a recent engagement where I was involved in with a client. They have 50 people offshore, and they were having trouble with two things. One is ramping up their staff offshore and the quality of the work that was coming from there. And they also needed to want to have flexibility. So we looked at it together jointly, the vendor, myself, and the client. And it turned out they could break the project down into two ways. The first was that they needed about 10 people offshore that had high level of experience, and the other 40 could be report writers. That made things a lot easier for everybody. The vendor could staff up more easily. Then they could fluctuate their workforce up and down because they could do that with the report writing folks. At the end of the day, it met all of their needs. This is what I mean by right project structure. So the simple model of I will do the same thing with same numbers of people offshore might work, but at the same time be creative, take a look at it, and see if you can structure it for success for everybody. Meaningful incentives. You know, if the offshore team continues to improve productivity over time, their staffing might go down. Now, I'm not saying it will, it might go down. Given that situation, their revenues might also go down. So you need to provide incentives for them so that it is a win-win for everyone. The last point I want to make here is regular audits. Here, what happens? Over time, the processes change, your own products change, your people change, all these things change. So even if your offshoring was good at one point in time, it might change over time. So I recommend everyone to audit their operations about once a year. So the next issue that people face is high turnover offshore. Scott, what's the problem here? Just because there's turnover. At the end of the day, if there is turnover offshore, it is additional cost to you and a hidden or unexpected expense because you either have to train more people or, well, actually at the end of the day you have to train more people, and because the people are new, it might even affect your schedules. So an unplanned expense. So what can you do? I talked earlier about planned rotations in the contract sense. You may want to make sure that planned rotations are well managed. The right metrics that incentivizes both the vendor and you would go a long way. Here is an example of a right metric. I hear turnover As an example, somebody says, okay, my turnover in my company is 8%. It's interesting, but that is not the metric that you want to focus on. Supposing you have a center of 300 people offshore, you want to take a look at what the metric is in your center. So that is more relevant to you. If you're running a project offshore, you might want to take a look at what the turnover is for that particular situation. So drill down and understand what the metrics are for you, turnover metrics are for your own situation, and address those. Incentives, you can provide incentives to staff offshore much the same way as you do here. We have tried that in several client situations. It works, but you need to do that very carefully in conjunction with your vendor and your legal department, because the risk that you run is at the end of the day, you don't want to have IRS come down on you and treat your offshore vendor staff as yours. It leads to all sorts of other problems. But it can be done. It has been done. People are people. The next point here, the people are people. They all want to do interesting work. To the extent that you can provide them more interesting work over time, they are more likely to stay with you. You can also cross-train people between projects, and overstaffing is also a notion of shadowing. Some vendors would provide this facility to you, and some of them would do it at no additional cost to you. So these are things you can negotiate. The notion here is maybe if you got a 10 to 12% project, and it's a very critical one, they may put 1 or 2 people, and they may find that they are shadowing the other people, and if there is turnover, the other person can jump in and take over and reduce the impact on you. So these are some of the things that you can do to improve offshore productivity. And if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk about excessive escalation. This thing happens a lot in the support/call center environment. And what's the problem? The problem is the vendor staff handles the easier calls, but they escalate complex issues more quickly than desired to the headquarters, to the in-house team. This is again a hidden cost to you. If they are doing too much of that, you got to staff up more at your in-house staff, which then means it is an extra cost to you that you weren't counting on doing. Okay, so how can you resolve this, or what are my recommendations for addressing this? Number 1, benchmark. You can benchmark your offshore staff and how they are doing against your own in-house center, or if you are having multiple centers, against multiple centers. So that gives you a starting point. And it's always a trade-off between somebody sitting on the problem and working with a client for too long, making the customer not very happy, at the same time escalating it too quickly. So you got to help your team offshore understand what the trade-offs are. You got to train them, revisit and train them again. So you got to constantly monitor this and help them, and you provide objective feedback, and these things really work, but it's got to be done right, and that's a key point in making sure that you don't have escalations more than necessary, and you don't have hidden costs. Okay, in the next slide, this is the checklist. I said I will talk about half a dozen or so key points, and I have addressed all of those. And what is the common denominator? Let's go on to the next slide. And the things that I am proposing is how you measure and motivate the service providers. This is the common thread. And I want to share with you a couple of quotes I found interesting. So if you read the first one, too often the measures that we use for success are process-based or output-based instead of outcome-based. But why does that happen? It is very easy or easier to implement for people to go and say, look, I want 25 people. It's a people-based relationship, right? So if you are going to set up an outcome-based, then it is much more complex. It takes work, and it takes work on both sides. So a lot of people are reluctant to do it from both sides. However, in driving, the next quote here, in driving towards outcome-based metrics where possible, we get to the heart of the matter, the essence of what the program is really supposed to provide. You don't go offshore to simply to hire people. You go offshore to do some work, to get some results, to get some end result. So how can you address this? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Consider outcome-based metrics. This is being done. I'm seeing instances of this more increasingly. Now, what do you get out of this particular model? This is a model that gets you both on the same page. There is a goal alignment, and the vendor is more motivated to innovate as opposed to simply run a more efficient organization with the same numbers of people, and it would create potentially higher benefits for you. However, the vendor resistance happens because they want to be sure if the metrics are right, will it benefit them, and are the metrics under their control, to what extent are their control, and what are the organizational roles and responsibilities. So these are some of the pros and cons of outcome-based metrics, and that can be implemented. Okay, I will share with you quickly a case study of how this was done, because it's a pretty important concept. So I want to go into a little bit more depth here. This is a security products company, consumer-oriented, and the application is support for voice, email, and chat. They had about 350 support agents, and during the first year, they used the staff augmentation model, and they measured response time, number of calls handled, and they ended up at the end of year one at the CSAT of about this customer satisfaction index of 2.7 out of 4. It wasn't bad, but that was that. Now, year number two, what the customer wanted to do was to increase the support, but they really didn't want to simply increase numbers of people offshore. After a lot of deliberation, together they made the decision to move to outcome-based model that I'm describing here, and now they put in different metrics in place. First call resolution and CSAT improvement. This is, I'm stressing, it is improvement, not just meeting customer satisfaction improvement. So sorry, not just meeting customer satisfaction index. Okay, so at the end of year two, what they found was the CSAT had moved to 3.2 out of 4, and since then the first call resolution went up, volume of calls handled per person also went up. So it was win all the way around. But there was also one more win I haven't yet talked about. The revenue model had been changed, so the vendor was amply rewarded for making all these improvements. So vendor revenues also went up. That's the key point. So it was a win-win for everyone involved. So I'm talking about all of these various ideas here. How do you implement that? I've taken the most common issues and I've given you broadly my recommendations about these common issues. And what I find is every client that I work with is unique. They have specific situations. So you need to customize these for your own situation. You may find that you only have 1, 2, or 3 of the issues I've talked about, or you may even have some other issues I have not talked about. So my key point here is at the end of the day, make sure that you take this information when you get ready to implement. You will need to customize that to your own situation. You're also going to find some you can implement immediately and some need a lot of planning to go do. Let's go to the next slide. I want to give a 30 to 60-second commercial about offshoring success. Here are the reasons that clients come to us. We are focused upon making sure that the offshoring that you are doing is optimized and you get more value to achieve offshoring success. Situations vary. Some are really not sure if they're getting value. Some know that things are failing and they need help. Some simply want to go ahead and improve benefits. How do we, several solutions are there, and I'll throw out a few solutions here. Typically in those kinds of things, we engage in an offshoring audit that goes from both sides, both for the vendor and for the client. We come back and make a series of implementable recommendations, and we are available to not only advise but to help implement those solutions. The other solution that we provide is management development. I talked about earlier about multicultural issues and knowing how to run an offshore program. We have an on-demand solution. If you go to our website, it's available directly from there. It's anytime, anywhere. One individual can take it, or we can offer that on-site, customized at your location. In addition to that, there are strategy evaluations, contract evaluations, and so on. But at the end of the day, all our solutions are highly customized to meet your particular situation, and we aim to help you achieve offshoring success, as the name implies. With that, I'm going to turn this back to Frank.
Sam, thank you so much. I have a handful of questions here that I wanted to run by you, submitted by our attendees here. Well, one is more of a logistical one, had to do with, will the presentation be available? The answer is yes. There will be an email that goes out to each of you who have registered that will link you to this webinar presentation recorded on demand, if you will. And there'll also be an opportunity for you to download Sam's PowerPoint should you wish. So I'm just skimming through a list of, actually not skimming, I'll take them one at a time here. So one comment says, at times vendors manipulate and are willing to pay for penalties that add resources to the project to meet their service levels. Any comments on that statement, Seth?
Yes. You know, this thing goes to metrics. You need to be at some level, whether it's at the contract or the project, you need to define the metrics very clearly. There are two things that go on. It's the metrics and the relationship between you and the vendor. I want to expand on that a bit here. You need to be having a great relationship with the vendor. You need to build up trust. And as long as the trust is there that you are taking care of them or they're taking care of you, manipulation kind of issues should not enter the picture. Then in terms of communication, what you also want to do is make sure that your metrics are very clear, so it is not subject to interpretations. So those are the two things I can offer. Setting up long-term good vendor relationship, open communications, treating them as a partner, not as somebody distant somewhere. All of those takes time to build, but that has been done in many, many instances that can be done. The second, even with that, you need to have clear-cut metrics.
Okay, so next question I have here has to do with some additional categories of costs. So what about telecom costs, travel, network reliability? Have each of these presented hidden costs as well, typically?
You know what? I wouldn't treat them as hidden costs, because when I work with clients, before we say, okay, here is how much we expect to, as an example, save out of this particular initiative, we take a look at sum total costs, which is really the combination of the people costs of the vendor, what you pay the vendor. In addition to that, you must add telecommunication costs, frequent visits to the partner/vendor location for travel, etc. Additional management costs. You may need to appoint a relationship manager, or your own managers may need more effort to manage. So these are all things that we would add on early on, and they are more explicitly known, and they are very predictable. The other things are listed in this presentation. They are much more unexpected costs that go on if you don't manage them. My answer is I don't treat the telecom and these costs as hidden costs. They should be explicit. They are very definable. You should know, you should factor that in before you find out how much you think you're going to save.
Right. So next question is, can you provide examples to show the difference between output metrics and outcome metrics? Output versus outcome?
Yeah. The output is, for example, I answered 20 calls in a day. That is my personal output. Or I wrote 5,000 lines of code. That's an output. Outcome is, for example, this is easier to illustrate with a support kind of a situation. What is the vice president of support measured as? He is measured by his customer satisfaction and how much is he improving year over year from one to the next, and how is he reducing his cost of providing the support. So those are outcomes that he or she is measured at. So those are things that I consider outcomes, and other things are simply tasks and outputs.
Okay. See how many we could squeeze in here with time that we have left. Does the cost of offshoring engagements tend to go up using the outcome-based metrics? Your experience, Seth? Does it become more expensive?
No, I do not. I do not see them becoming more expensive. Your staffing costs and all the other costs will remain the same. In fact, if you're going towards outcome-based, at the end of the day, you should have a smoother running and, in fact, less expensive operation and not more expensive.
Okay,
but I'm sorry, Frank, I will hasten to add, though, implementing an outcome-based metric model takes effort. You got to really define various things and make sure all those things happen, and you got to have the vendors' cooperation to make it all happen. But the direct answer to what you're asking is no, I do not believe it's going to increase expenses.
Seth, can you describe how the revenue model for the vendor was changed in the case study?
Correct. So in the case study, instead of paying them on a person month basis or the headcount basis, we basically provided a share of the reduced support cost, because we were able to actually, I'll give you some fictitious numbers here. Let's say the support cost was $10 million for the organization. So we were able to do 30 or 40% more with the same budget. Instead of increasing the support cost to $13 million, we were still able to do with $10 million, which meant that there was $3 million of additional gain. We built a model around that kind of thing. This is not a very specific thing. I can't tell you exactly what happened in their particular case because of confidentiality, but I want to illustrate the point nonetheless. So out of that, we said, look, if we make this kind of an improvement, you, the vendor, will realize this percentage of the improvement. So it really meant both were taking risks and sharing the rewards. It's a risk-reward sharing model.
Okay. Next question is, in which geos do you provide the audit services? And by that, yes, I guess the question is which geographies?
We have, the geography is really uh, we are location agnostic. The principles that we work with, those work really any place. It could be India, it could be Philippines, it could be East Germany, or it could be China. A lot of the work we have done in the past has tended to be India only because that seems to be the destination that most people have gone to in the last several years.
Chef, do you have...
We are able to provide that anywhere.
Okay. Chef, do you have a viewpoint on the increase of offshore resources now being located onshore within the U.S.? So it's kind of offshore talent, but being located here on site. Any sense of what's driving that dynamic?
I don't have an exact metric to give you on that. I do some people bringing people more locally here, but at the end of the day, if that's a big component of the overall engagement, it begins to defeat the cost model. Because once you are here, you really need to pay them competitive salaries and local salaries, local cost of living, all those things increase. But more importantly, what I see most people do is there are people on site who facilitate communication with offshore staff, or you see people rotating in and out, coming in here to understand the specs and have more in-depth discussions, and people coming in here for more training. Those kinds of things have been done for a very long time. I haven't, I can't say I've seen a significant increase in that type of activity per se.
I have a question here, Seth, regarding LPO, legal outsourcing and offshoring. Are there any additional hidden costs beyond what you have already mentioned that would pertain specifically to legal outsourcing?
Let me think about that for a second. I have to say I'm not intimately familiar with legal, outsourcing per se. So given that, I would hesitate to comment on and give you an opinion one way or the other. There may be hidden costs, but I frankly am not an attorney, and I've not worked directly with attorneys. I've done a lot of work with IT, BPO, and a bunch of other things, but not with attorneys, so I'm opting out of answering that. I just don't know.
Seth, I had wanted to ask you about your experience. Are the majority of these kind of relationships that need to be fixed, are the majority of them with beginners, first-time outsourcers, just because they're new to this, or do you see a lot of the disconnect with the more experienced ones because they're treating it really kind of like a staff aug?
Most of the instances that I have seen are in the latter category. That is, people who have been at it for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and some of the clients that I have seen, some of our clients have been at it for half a dozen years or more. That is where I've seen the majority of them. I'm not saying that we have a few in the beginning of the relationships, but the majority of them have been with people who have been outsourcing between 3 and 5 years.
Seth, as I listen to your presentation, one would assume that you're typically hired by the client. I would think, there's a client that's saying that, we made this commitment, it's not working, we'd like you to come in and look around, see if we could fix this, or if we should just kind of, move on. But I could also see a scenario where a service provider may approach you and say, we have this client, they're driving us nuts, but we think it could be fixed as well. Have you ever been hired by the service provider?
Frank, just looking at history, we have not been hired by the service providers to date. We can provide this particular service regardless of whether the trigger comes from the service provider or or the client, per se, either one. At the end of the day, we end up working with both parties to make sure it's a win-win solution for all of them.
Great. And last question I have here has to do with just metrics. This question I see here submitted, are there good metrics in general for an offshore? Is there kind of one set of metrics? I know you hate to avoid, you want to avoid saying one size fits all, but is there one, are there one good set of metrics for offshoring in general?
No. Offshoring in general, by the way, offshoring cuts across so many different disciplines, like you mentioned, from legal process to IT to BPO to tech support to product development, you name it, there are whole bunch of different areas. And I would really hesitate to give one metric and say it would fit even most cases. I don't know of any.
Well, Seth, we had some audio problems on the front end, and it looks like we're getting back into that audio zone. So maybe we'll use that as our cue to begin to wrap up. I guess in a nutshell, some of the things I jotted down. It's interesting to see that, in many cases, what is creating some of these challenges have less to do with pricing, and in many cases has less to do with SLAs. It strikes me as interesting that a good amount of this has to do with the of more, I would say, right side of the brain things like good communication, relationship building, understanding of one's culture of the team you're dealing with across the table or across the pond, if you will. So it's interesting to see that. So I'm not surprised, but I see that coming up more and more as people asking questions around, hey, the pricing is right, we're meeting SLAs, still not working, right? So I appreciate you bringing those to light. I appreciate you, again, taking the time for this presentation. Hopefully, Seth, we can get you to come back and do a part 2. I know there's a lot more you can share with us. For those of you who have any additional questions, in the follow-up email that David will send out, we'll have Seth's email address, and again, there'll be a copy of the a recording of this webinar if you want to share it with any colleagues internally. Thank you again for taking time for today's webinar, and keep an eye out for future announcements of Outsourcing Institute webinars and even a handful of events that we'll be announcing in the coming weeks. Thanks again.
Thank you all.